we'll have one or two extra down here. Please welcome Dr. Campbell once again.
Okay. Now, I begin by, of course, thanking you for coming. At least the weather's much more hospitable tonight. But I just mention a couple of things about last week's lecture. I said that when I started doing New Testament research, I was horrified at how anti-Jewish many of the New Testament commentaries were. Now, I should have said that isn't any longer the case, or at least not to the same extent. There's been quite a sea change in the last 30 years even in that arena. And also, I said, mixed a group of people together who were murdered in Hitler's regime. And I said 6 million. It's 6 million Jews, which I very well knew, but it came over as if it was a total of 6 million. It was 20 or more million, and many of you know that very well. So that is not, I was trying to be inclusive to show that it was not just religious people who died, but all sorts of people. Now, my topic this evening is Christian self-understanding in the face of the other and its relevance for social harmony. Now, I have plenty of experience in many ways. I left Northern Ireland before the Troubles really began, but I know all about it from many people who have lived through them and worked there. But I'm not speaking out of Northern Ireland alone. Our world in which we live is a pretty fierce world. And one of the good things about the ongoing revolution in Egypt is that it seems that it's possible to avoid some of the violence that we associate with change. We continue today by starting with the emphasis of the last two lectures on the importance of our identity for social harmony. By this we take as a given that Christians and other religious people ought to be confident in their own faith in order to witness to others. We stress that Christian identity is foundationally and continually indebted to Judaism. It is not self-standing in and by itself, and therefore Christians need to be humble and to have a sober estimate of themselves and their faith. Breaking down the middle wall of partition by Christ does not erase either Jewish or Gentile identity, nor does it remove diversity entirely, but it enables peace to break out where there was hostility because of difference. It is the hostility arising from difference that must be erased, not the diversity itself. And when I'm talking to the students, when you hear Pauline texts saying that there's no such thing as circumcision or uncircumcision, that is rhetoric. He's talking about the value of circumcision and the relative value of this and that. So always be careful when people make comparisons. You can't quote part of the comparison and forget about the rest. You can't have half of a New Testament text and use it and forsake the other half. Nor do we suggest that Christian identity itself should be downplayed. Far from it. Only a confident Christian identity can properly deal with real religious and cultural difference. And the same is true for other religions. Only when you're confident of your own religion and proud of it can you really talk to other people. We start from the premise that in this country founded on Christian principles of freedom and so on, it is right and good and proper, in fact absolutely essential, that the children are taught the meaning of their parents' faith. We want our children to be strong in the faith and the identity of their fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers. We want them to know who they are and what are the traditions they have inherited. But the question is, who should teach this? Is it the family only? In the UK, we have a different policy. And you have this policy, which I'm not well acquainted with, but I know that it is the policy that you keep church and state separate. In the UK, one possible solution is a faith-based school. There were always some of these, particularly Anglican. I went to a Quaker school by accident because I got a scholarship there. But recently in the UK, Islamic schools have been founded. Is this a good or a bad practice? There were, of course, as I mentioned, Church of England, Roman Catholic schools, some Jewish, some Presbyterian. But if you're going to be fair, other religions must also have the opportunity to have their own schools. The UK tries to do justice to diverse faiths by the teaching of RE in state schools. The schools will have an agreed syllabus to teach, so teachers do not teach themselves. In fact, teachers ought not to teach themselves in any subject, but they teach the views that are generally accepted and educationally recognized as appropriate. One of my lifelong colleagues has spent several years recently, as part of his academic teaching at the University of Birmingham, preparing a new RE syllabus agreed by representatives of all the main faiths in the city of Birmingham, as well as by the city's directors of education. That, I think, is a great privilege for one person to lead a team that is very multi-faith, and the last syllabus they had lasted for 35 years. So that, I hope, will be a great contribution to the future. In school religious education, neither the children nor the teachers have to be of any specific faith in the UK. But they do have to be religiously educated and professionally qualified to teach RE in state schools. That is, they must be properly recognized teachers in that subject. It is very important in a school that might have 80% Muslims to have a Muslim RE teacher as a good role model. Some 25 years ago, I had a fine young Muslim lad called Abdul Nouri. I didn't know him at first, but because he came and chatted to me about his background, I discovered he was an East African Indian Muslim whose family had to flee East Africa to escape civil unrest. But at the time he came to my college to do religious studies, we had no specific course at West Hill College for Muslims. So he and one or two others had to do Hebrew Bible, New Testament studies, and Christian theology that Muslims would not normally have to do. But he succeeded very well, and some staff were even invited to their first Muslim wedding when he got married. He has taught successfully in Birmingham secondary schools all these years. And just recently I had a note from him saying that his son was also becoming an RE teacher in a state school. Now, this teacher had a very mixed identity in terms of coming from India via East Africa and living the rest of his life in Birmingham. He is confident in his identity as a devout Muslim and also happy to live with all kinds of neighbours in a city like Birmingham. And he keeps in touch with the many Christian students who were with him in his college days. His son, coming from such a fine home, will also make a real contribution to the teaching of RE and intercommunal understanding. Although we did not at first have an appropriate educational course for him as a Muslim, we were encouraged to develop one. So we proposed an educational degree course at the University of Birmingham to prepare Muslims to become RE teachers in the state system. A delegation had to go to the Ministry of Education in London to gain permission to start this new course for RE teachers. It had to be open to anyone who wanted to study it, but it was designed specially to give expertise in Islamic studies in education. Now, this delegation of 16 people, of which I was not one, went to London at the height of the First Gulf War, where there was real bad feeling about Islam and Muslims in general. But amazingly, the government recognized the value and educational significance of our course. The outcome of this was that prior to this time, an RE teacher had to have studied a course in Christian theology. And the question we went to the Ministry of Education with, can Muslims do a similar course in Islamic theology and thereby qualify for teaching in the state system? This was the issue, but to our delight, our request was granted, and we started an Islamic studies course with students who wished to become RE teachers, with 12 Muslim women and 4 students of Christian background. And the whole 16 of them worked happily together for the duration of their 4 years course. And I reckon that those 4 students of Christian background really were the most integrated and multicultural, multi-faith people you can imagine. But they did fine, and they all got on well together. Now, if we take the above project as an example, it will be clear what I mean. As a college with a Christian foundation, we were invited by local Muslim leaders to set up a course designed in particular for young Muslim women whose families did not wish them to go to another city to study away from home. Now, I should make clear that as an institution, we wanted an increase in students at that time. So this new course represented an expansion, rather than running the risk of taking places away from other groups to give them to Muslims. That's what people would say if that were not the situation. Also, the main funding came from the government, not from Christian funding, although the local Muslims did sponsor some of the first lecturers. This was an exciting and sometimes a worrying development. But it was a success, and these young Muslims actually preferred to study in a religious foundation rather than a secular. Now, I think that's quite telling. The question to be asked was, are the leaders of this degree course right to give their time to develop Islamic courses, especially in a Christian religious foundation? The point was that our college had been founded by a Canadian Presbyterian minister in 1907 to give teaching for Sunday school teachers. Then it expanded with the help of the Cadbury Trust and all the Cadbury factories and so on around about into other education courses, such as teacher education, youth work, and then multi-faith and mission work. Students did not have to be committed Christians, but only willing and capable to do the curriculum presented. And now today, we have at least 8 or more Muslim schools in the UK, and some evangelical Christians have started their own schools because they think the state schools are too liberal and do not teach enough of the Christian faith. Now, these are all legitimate, but which of these schools is contributing most to social harmony in the wider society? Both are doing important and valuable work, but which one serves the wider community in which they are located? Several of our Muslim students have now completed doctoral studies and lecture at the University of Birmingham and elsewhere. Most notable is one graduate who, upon getting his PhD degree, soon became head teacher of a group of Muslim schools in the city of Leicester. And now when the BBC or other media want someone to comment on some political event in the world, he is the moderate and educated voice that can speak for many British Muslims. And this person knows Christians and Christianity because he studied under these and with these. So I think that this project has contributed to the development of a new, balanced, educated, and politically involved Muslim leadership. If one wants to be a narrowly committed Christian, there is plenty of good work to be done. But people like Martin Luther King have shown us a different way. If we do not enable minorities to use their gifts for society, that society is losing out. Young people's lives are being wasted for lack of opportunity to contribute. So in a sense, it's patronizing for me to talk about giving education to Muslims. We should be saying that these young people have gifts and valuable strengths to add to our society. And we want to make sure that society gets the best contribution from all quarters. And the same applies, of course, to people without opportunity elsewhere. Christians are called to be the salt of the earth. But if the salt and the earth are compartmentalized, then they cannot possibly influence one another. I am advocating a committed but open and inclusive model of Christianity, and especially of Christian education. So long as there is an agreed curriculum for all schools, as in the UK, there can be no problem. But the government itself must supervise and regulate such. The democratic state has an obligation to take care of all sectors of its population. But by itself, the state cannot do everything. And this is where universities like John Carroll and other religious foundations have a unique contribution to make. Mainline Christian denominations have not been as widely visible as some of the extreme versions of our faith. We need to use the media to educate the general public. Cardinal Newman, who will be well known to many of you, wrote and debated the concept of a university nearly around a century ago, and his contribution has been recognized recently. And Newman College, with which I worked for 7 years in collegial fellowship, is one of the outcomes of his thinking. And so, about 20 years ago, we had the opportunity to put together this Christian foundation called the Celio Colleges, which had Baptist, Presbyterian, Anglican, Quaker, and other colleges, with Newman College, a large Roman Catholic college next door. And we, at one time, tried to have a Christian university between ourselves and Newman. But unfortunately, the enemies were not the religious people. The enemies were secular religious educationalists who were frightened of being in a religious institution and tried to make out that, of course, these Roman Catholics and Presbyterians and so on couldn't possibly agree. We could, but they were not as tolerant. And the result was that Newman College is still flourishing as a teacher education college and arts degrees and other humanities and postgraduate. But eventually, my own particular college was amalgamated with the University of Birmingham. So sometimes if we do not take the opportunities that are given, we lose them and lose them very rapidly. Now, when we talk about this wider faith narrative, this faith narrative and its relevance for the wider society, we come again to some aspects of identity. In the modern world, particularly when people are dealing with individuals, we have discussions of nested identities, hybrid identities, composite identities, and so on. In order to understand earlier periods of history, we need to some extent envision them from the perspective of our own society, this hermeneutical circle that we can't get out of. To interpret means to read the unknown from the perspective of what we know already. But we cannot simply transfer conceptions of the 21st century back to the first, nor vice versa. If we do read back our presuppositions, we will only find our own society reflected anachronistically in a different era. I have argued in the other lectures that Paul advised his community members to remain as they were when called. But this was in the first century. And last week I stressed that what that meant was that Christian identity is inevitably grounded in Jewish foundations. And because of that, Christianity is never complete or independent in itself, not even today, because we have our roots in Judaism. So because of that, this means, in Paul's terms, remember your Jewish roots today. That's something that we need to remember as Christians. But it is more than that, and I will move on to the next issue. This was the first century, and many of our modern assumptions do not simply fit into that era. And when we use identity discussions to assist in understanding the modern era, we must be very careful that we do not read them simply straight back into Paul's lifetime. One of the most popular areas of scholarship in recent years has been research on identity formation. And it's important for us tonight because I'm particularly interested in the identity formation of young people. Not the identity formation of Christians, but the identity formation of young people generally. My wife's daughter was doing some research for a marketing company in Switzerland, and one of the things they've been looking at is that the social development of young people seems to have extended to the age of 26. They're not fully mature now until a later period. And so therefore, this might be a good time before they get too old to help them to find a real identity. In the social sciences, this emphasis on identity has been based quite strongly on anthropological research from a post-colonial perspective. Scholars have been interested to see how people seem to have developed composite or nested identities from two or more cultures. I was taught by Anthony Hansen, who is an Anglican professor, a biblical scholar, and he was proud to call himself Anthony Terrell Hansen because he was Anglo-Irish. That was his description. It might thus be possible in the modern time to claim to have two or more levels of identity. Is a person like an onion, from which you can remove differing layers until you reach the core. Of course, this is an analogy, and so are all the rest. Nested identities is based on those small camping utensils that save space by fitting neatly together, as if it were in one nest. Or one might claim dual identity, as Jewish and British, or someone claimed some 50 years ago, German and Jewish. The situation might be much more complicated today for young immigrants brought up in one culture and then transferred to another. Sometimes these mixed identities are seen as a fusion of two cultures into a third subculture. And using another analogy, a language analogy, it could be argued that there's a border area between, say, French and German or French and Italian, where a mixture of both languages, a fusion or hybrid of two tongues is spoken. But such a hybrid language does not really exist. The only example is Creole language in Haiti and one or two other exceptional places, where slaves were individualized and almost completely uprooted. These are not normal circumstances of human interaction. Thus, we need to be careful with our terminology. Recently, Wallace Hadrill, a classic scholar in the United Kingdom and Reading, has criticized the easy assumption of some conceptions of identity. He points out that fusion of metals for smelting does not take place naturally, but only under the most enormous pressure. The strata of archaeology may intersect, but they never fuse. And human history suggests that successive cultural influences rarely cancel the traces and memories of the past. So we do not get fusion, but only in colonial circumstances where one nation has dominated another. Differing cultures do not simply blend to form one new entity, such as creolization. Rather, the elements of both cultures can survive in plurality alongside each other, perhaps creating discrepant identities, identities in tension, or even simply parallel or coexistent ones. Hadrill points out that hybrids in nature are frequently infertile or unable to perpetuate the species. And he comes to the conclusion that fusion and hybridity are not good models for understanding identity. And my point is that quite often it works all right, perhaps with one individual, but it does not work in the wider discussions of identity. In a border area where two languages intermingle, there is not really a fusion, but elements of the two languages are taken up and used as required. Now, my wife grew up in Basel with French speakers next door, and her grandfather being French, and the rest of them all speaking German. And what she remembers is that when they were growing up, they didn't know all these odd words that their grandfather used. And then eventually discovered he was cursing in French, so they wouldn't know. Thus, identifiable elements of each language remain distinct, but side by side within the vocabulary of the population. Thus, the same is true even in areas like the UK and the USA for young Muslims and others who intermingle within their own identity two or more powerful cultures and religions. So the problem for these young people is that they inhabit, as it were, the border area between two very different cultures or differing ways of viewing the world. And if there is real and ongoing cultural conflict between these two major cultures or systems, the Kulturkampf takes place within these people, who are thus inevitably caught up in the conflict. Hadrill noted the possibility of discrepant identities, that is, elements of identities that do not harmonize easily. So by intensifying the conflict nationally, culturally, and in terms of religion, we intensify the conflict for such young people, especially if they are stopped frequently in the streets, as happens in time of cultural conflict and danger. Our religion should not be a contributing factor to such social conflict. Understanding the other who is different is a prerequisite for social understanding and harmony. Most serious of all, and this needs to be recognized, this kind of conflict is an emotional conflict. Deep loyalties are being challenged. Sometimes the Protestant groups in Northern Ireland were called the Loyalists, and the same in King Charles and other times in England. But an emotional conflict is a very difficult one. When we had problems some years ago in the UK about whether and where Sikhs should wear their turbans, some British people treated the issue casually, as if it were merely a question of fashion, like a woman wearing or not wearing a hat. But that is to misunderstand the difference between minor details of which clothing one can wear. Maybe hats are not minor details, but sometimes they can be. But you must not confuse strong religiously sanctioned convictions with fashion. Very, very different thing. We do make choices about clothing in line with preferred taste, but religious affiliation is not on the same level as fashion. We may choose the hobbies we prefer, but our convictions are more like beliefs that hold us, rather than beliefs we choose to hold. Martin Luther's cited, "Here I stand, I can do none other." But that is a good example, if you like, of what to him was a conviction. I have known people who gave up certain very conservative patterns when they were married, but were never, even 40 years later, quite at home in their newfound freedom. And that, I think, is where you see the emotional pull and our ability to understand it is one thing, but to leave it is quite another. To have loyalties is to feel obligated to deep commitments. And this is the problem of having loyalty to two apparently incompatible views of the world. And that is what some of our young people in the UK are facing, and possibly also here. Understanding the conflicts that our neighbours or their teenage children face will greatly decrease the amount of misunderstanding and facilitate communal peace. What we're saying is that young Muslims in the West may be given a fine religious upbringing as Muslims. They may have a very good family, and they may have been taught loyalty to parents and to parental faith. But when they meet their peer group in the Western world, they develop attachments to a very different pattern of life than that in the home. Most serious of all is the question of family honor, so important in Mediterranean societies. Now, if Islam in Iraq or Afghanistan is portrayed as backward, unjust, or lacking in civil rights, if these young people feel that they and their culture is not properly valued, even despised, then these young men in particular feel they ought to do something to uphold or restore family honor, and the honor of Islam in particular. And so they may join some extreme Islamic organizations to offer them a chance to honor their own religion and family. And this might seem strange, but I watched part of that 4-hour saga of Pearl Harbor recently. And those young men were seeking to restore the honor of America after the Japanese had destroyed so many ships and so many people. So it's not an odd emotion to want to uphold the honor of your family and your faith. Another factor is very important. Where a young people is solidly committed to the communal faith in which they were brought up, most likely they will be secure enough not to be carried away with extremists of any kind. And I'm not talking about whether or not they're religious. They may not be religious, they may choose not to be. But if they're secure in their own life stance, then that's very important and valuable. But if they drift along unthinkingly, and parents just presume they will eventually conform, such young people may very well be at risk. Even if they're committed to some strange ideology, they are likely to stay with it and be sustained from other similar or worse options. But the person at risk in our society is the young person who has no serious commitments. Perhaps they had parents who felt they had to allow their children to make up their own minds, as my parents did. And so perhaps they did not deliberately give them any religious education, or perhaps discuss religion with them at all. Now, this may seem fine, but our modern Western society is so diverse and so secular that if parents and grandparents do not deliberately and conscientiously teach the faith, then their children are unlikely to find it for themselves, and may in fact find something very different through the internet or elsewhere. The world in which many of our young people live and are allowed to live is a virtual world, and it does not prepare them all that well for this world. Generally speaking, the internet has value and virtue. What I'm thinking about, I may say what's behind it. My grandson, who is 5-year-old, got into trouble at school, and the teacher asked the parents to come in and talk. And what happened was he had been asking everybody what did they think about sex. Now, he's 5-year-old, and he couldn't stop. He couldn't leave the subject down. And my daughter tells me that she thinks the problem arose, he'd seen something on television that they hadn't even seen, they didn't know what it was, and he did not like the idea of this sexual activity. And he was very worried that he'd have to get involved in it. But this, I think, is what can happen in a normal family. I'm not speaking here of those young people who conscientiously and deliberately choose a different faith or ideology from their family. That is their privilege. At least they've made their choice and are presumably a happy and integrated person as a result. But what I am talking about is what I've entitled the risk of squatters in a long unoccupied house. It has long been the pattern for homeless people in the UK and cities like London and elsewhere to take advantage of long vacant property by taking it over as a temporary home. Now, some young people might simply wreck the property, but if they're wise and remain unobtrusive, they may be able to remain there for quite some time. My daughter, at one point in her life, had a boyfriend who lived for 2 years when he was studying at the City of London in such property. Some property agents in cities like London allow illegal occupancy. If the people are not causing problems, they turn a blind eye and permit the squatters to remain there till the building is required for other tenants. At least they don't set it on fire or damage it. Of course, these people have no rights and might be evicted at a moment's notice. I remember hearing a story from my uncle who lived and died in Barrie, Ontario. He told me of an Irish fisherman who emigrated to Ontario many years ago. Having no money and a great desire to fish, he took over a small island in a river and built himself a cabin there. He had a great sight for fishing and he was very happy. But years later, the local authorities tried to evict him. But they failed, because having been there so many years, he had acquired what are popularly called squatters' rights. So he lived happily in his cabin until a great storm came and the river rose very high and he and the cabin were both washed away. Now, what I'm referring to here is that squatters in a vacant property really have no rights or very, very limited rights. But this is an analogy for young people brought up without strong commitments. The story in the New Testament tells us about a man who brushed out his house, swept it and cleaned it and left it in beautiful condition. But the outcome was that 7 worse demons came and lived in it. And if we do not give our children a faith to live by, someone else will, and it may be very different from what we would wish. I would like to illustrate this by example from Switzerland. A very well-to-do middle-class family deliberately decided they would not determine whether their children were Christians or not. They seriously thought it was better not to discuss religion with them, presuming that when they grew up, they would make a good choice for themselves. They had 2 boys and a girl. Normal young people who went to university like their peers. But unfortunately, the 2 sons got caught up in a very extreme Christian sect. And the family were horrified. But there was nothing that they could do once these young people got involved. This was not so serious as when in 1994 the Sun Temple group went into the Swiss Valleys area and 74 people joined in a group suicide pact that horrified the world, most of all Switzerland, which is one of the most balanced and egalitarian and religious of societies. But the different cantons in Switzerland, I should have said also most democratic, the different cantons in Switzerland, the different counties or cantons, of which there are 26 like Ireland, vote on whether there will be religious education on the school curriculum. Each one makes its own determination. It so happened that this event took place in the French-speaking Geneva region, where there had been no religious education. John Calvin would be horrified. As a result of this tragedy, the canton authorities issued a very serious and detailed national report. The result was that they introduced a compulsory course in religious history and religious education for everyone. Now, this was not teaching Christianity. The aim was not to make people Christian or to become church members, but to promote general knowledge about religions and thus to make young people religiously literate. These courses were introduced for the safety and security of all young people by the local authorities. And this is how we should all be thinking, not just for our own children and children of our faith, but the children of the entire community. This may be something to consider in the light of minor variations in the pattern of education and religious education that sometimes appear in the press in relation to the USA. To avoid brainwashing or the religious perversion of young people, they themselves need to become religiously literate. Ever so often, even today, we still hear stories in the media of persons who, for one reason or another, even as young adults, are still unable to read and write. This is a serious handicap and embarrassment to the person concerned. But at least this impediment is discernible and recognized by the persons themselves and by those in whom they confide. Religious illiteracy is much more hard to identify, in that there are religiously literate persons who choose not to practice a form of religion. But if there is no teaching concerning the major world religions in school, how can young people learn about the faith of their peers? If they have only popular knowledge, all they will learn are the stereotypes and caricatures coming from other ignorant people or from such people as despise religion. Now, if religion were really unimportant, if it did not sometimes cause wars and divide societies, it would not matter what that people remain ignorant about it. But religion provides the worldview for a huge proportion of the citizens of this world. And as such, it must be respected, carefully taught, and even more carefully protected from simplistic assumptions of those who do not recognize its significance. Better religious literacy would in itself act as a reconciling force in limiting the power of ignorance about our most treasured beliefs. The degree courses we instituted in Birmingham to facilitate the education of Muslims was one successful attempt to ensure religious literacy. Our diplomatic service would be much more efficient and productive if its officials were all taught in the religion and culture of those with whom they negotiate. Understanding of another's culture, religion, and way of life is no simple task, not something for a quick crash course prior to traveling to that land. And especially when negotiation is about prisoners' lives, as it was recently. It is even more serious not to offend their captors. But rather than speak of international negotiations, our own national and state politicians often seem to make poor judgments about what to say and what not to say concerning even our own religious practices. So we get ignorant and uninformed views from politicians who should know better than add to that amount of prejudice that sweeps across our country in times of crisis. The outcome of this is that those who should be guiding public opinion are themselves part of the problem. What we need are independent thinkers or even just people who will ask questions to challenge assumptions such as we all know. To stop the spread of prejudice is to act as an agent of reconciliation. Some of the greatest prejudice comes from half-truths about those who are different. If you tell real lies about them, nobody pays any attention. So the secret is to tell half the truth, and the half that people may not like. It requires a critical distancing from such stories to check their validity or otherwise. Some are exaggerated, some are telling only half the truth. But what is sad is that in moments of crisis, such as the most recent Gulf War, many sensible people are drawn into an emotional reaction and leave their critical faculty behind. Once when I went back home to Northern Ireland from England, I happened to arrive with a group when a group of people were having a discussion. The teaching unions were very unhappy at this time because their wage levels were sinking in relation to other professions, and they were threatening to go on strike. When I visited Northern Ireland at that time, I was very much involved in teacher education. And these neighbours were discussing the teacher strike. The most of them knew that I was heavily involved in the education of teachers, and so were cautious in what they said. But one young man who had severe learning difficulties gave a very outspoken and severe criticism of teachers. All the usual, they had long holidays, short working hours, a nice easy job, and no reason to complain. In short, he gave us a very one-sided view of teachers' work and conditions. Now, I was quite surprised at this young man, until I realized that because of his lack of ability, he was only passing on what he took to be the general consensus and what therefore must be correct. It really was a very biased account that he presented, but I realized that this represented the unargued, uncritical prejudices, not of him so much as of his family and friends, only they were too polite to tell me. This young man had no critical ability to judge the truth of what he had heard, but emotionally felt the injustice of the teacher's claims, because all his neighbours thought as he had expressed, only they were much too wise to come out and say prejudiced things in my presence. Now, this is an interesting challenge. If such a young man were present in all of our discussions, how would he report them? Or if he sat with us when we're having a meal or a drink and listened into our conversation? But especially if it is not the actual words used, but the nuances behind them that really tells where we stand. Unspoken assumptions are picked up intuitively, and children learn from these. It's not what Dad says, but they know what the parents are really like. And that is because, like this young man, many things in society are emotionally and intuitively picked up. And this is where there is no escape. As parents, we are what our children know us to be. If we are silent when prejudice is flaunted in front of us, we're encouraging those uttering prejudiced thoughts to believe that we think these are valid, that these represent the genuine views of all the silent majority. The McCarthy era in America was not just the beginning of systematic repression of all who did not want to fight Marxism. It was, in my opinion, the beginning of a sort of McCarthy era in terms of religious people and activity. Christians and others seeking to victimize those who dared publicly to disagree with them. And we have never quite escaped from a certain nastiness, certain brutality in the competing sects and groups that comprise Christianity. This I see as a form of social terrorism, not the rule of the gun, but a similar reign of fear, using the media in the same way as the gun to terrorize your neighbors. Commitment to a proper religious faith does not require any kind of coercion. We need to hold our political representatives accountable for what they say or do not say. If we know something is wrong, we can ask a question, even if we're not 100% certain. If we can do nothing else, we can say, since I am not sure, I would not dare to comment until I check the facts. Many years ago, as a young minister, I had a clerk of session, that is the leading elder, who was very helpful and supportive when I first went there as a minister. I asked this man what kind of people certain families were so that I could be better prepared for my first visit to them. But he more or less refused to tell me anything except the minimal facts, where they lived, etc. Now, when I got to know this man better, I knew he absolutely refused to say anything critical of anyone. He said he would not be the bearer of bad images of other people. Whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are of good report, think on these things. He was a local farmer and milkman, but he was a superb clerk of session. See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And he knew it and lived it, and everybody respected him because of it. My elder taught me not to increase malicious gossip, not to be a party to prejudiced reports of others, and above all to accept people as they are without judging them or stereotyping them in advance. Now, this is especially true where people are culturally, racially, or religiously different from us. In order to understand others, we need to be affirmative as religious people about our own identity. Some people, I think, in lectures like this, feel that we are letting down the Christian faith. We're not standing up for it in front of other faiths. But that is not in any wise what I intend. We need to know who we are. At least we need to be in conversation internally with our own faith communities if there are big issues that affect our own self-understanding. But such affirmation includes asserting one's difference. We are not all the same in our religious commitment. There may well be differences between us that we cannot understand, at least not fully. But this should not hinder us living together in harmony. As mentioned already, it does not mean building walls to separate us from others. But if we are not embedded in our own faith narratives, it will be difficult to positively relate to the faith narrative of others. So if we want to talk to others, we need to discover first of all who it is that we are. And also, if we are insecure, those others may seem to be a threat to us. Thus, social harmony, living together in difference in a democratic society, requires both affirmation of one's own faith and embeddedness in it, as well as respect and acceptance of the other. A well-integrated person is a vital component of those who would become agents of reconciliation. And secondly, a confident Christian identity demands that we affirm others in their own identity. Now, this is where some people might disagree. Why should we as Christians have any obligation to assist other people in their identity? Some religious people might argue that it is our duty to teach and take care of our own children, the children of our own faith, but not of those of other faiths. It is not so simple to separate the two. Should we be willing to do something that might even indirectly support another faith, such as helping Muslim charities in times of crisis? I had this group of students, and they came to me to ask if they could put on a sale of work to raise money to help those damaged in a recent disaster. They were almost all Muslims, so what could I say? Would I come and open it and be present? Of course I had to, because I was their lecturer and head of the department, so I had to support my own students, whatever faith they were. And so this, in a sense, opened to me the general human concerns that we all share within our religions. And when we are asked to help, it does not matter whether it is this religion or that, if we approve of what these people are doing. Should we encourage Muslim children to be good Muslims? Or is it better to have confused Muslims or confused Christians as a danger to all of us? There are two different obligations to consider. As a faithful believer, I want to do all I can to promote the faith that I think is best for me. But if I work only with a Christian ghetto mentality, what happens to my social obligations? I'm a citizen of a country, and if I wish to be a good citizen, I will then do all I can to promote the welfare and security of all my fellow citizens. That being so, it may mean I have to consider the needs of others who do not believe any of the same things that I do, or even live the same way as I do. My position is that Christian or religious duty is not in conflict with my civic duty, because both of these call on me to make the same contribution to society as a whole. In the end, the person who is my neighbour and who needs me is where my duty must lie, whether this person is of my faith or none. The alternative to having a separatist mentality, is what we would call a sectarian stance. That is, I work only for my own little group, I give only to those of my own faith, I do nothing to support or make things better for the insecure and those lost between differing religions and cultures. Is it really better to allow young people to become confused, to have no sense of really belonging anywhere, to become a risk to all of us? Several of those from the United Kingdom prosecuted for trying to carry explosives on board planes in the last few years have been typically confused Muslim youths, torn between two cultures, valued very differently in two communities. Now that's not official research, that's my own knowledge of following the news and hearing of the lives of those young people. Such phenomena will increase rather than decrease in the coming years, and it is in the interest of all of us that such lost young people do not destroy either us or themselves or both. Think of the parents of such young people. The parents of such did not know the full extent of their young people's involvement. They were almost universally not radicals, but simply devout Muslims, parents whose children got lost between two cultures. The other factor in the UK is that an increasingly secular culture is being more and more the case. Religion itself is becoming marginalized. Now, you might think that's strange in the UK, where England has an established church. But here, the enemy of Christianity is not other faiths, but a very secular ethos in society, where in some instances it is hard for religious people to succeed if they are not very secular. Religion is in danger of being sidelined, so that only the exotic, the extremists, or the intolerant are given a voice. This means religion in the UK is much weaker than its history, or its social contribution, or its numbers would actually suggest. Today, religious people need one another as never before, and must therefore find room for corporate action, especially in relation to government policies. The fact that all religious leaders can agree a joint RE syllabus in their own city is very important, not just as a symbol of community cohesion, but in another dimension as well. The forces of secularism are strong and seek every chance to put religion down in public. But if the religions can recognize each other and act together, then religious minorities working together with the established church in England can provide an alternative to secularism and its militant progress. By asserting one's Christian identity in face of the other who is different, we are not being aggressive nor confrontational, but allowing genuine interaction to take place for the benefit of both. Religion is a terribly dangerous thing. It can be perverted to lead people to mass suicide, as I've noted. It can wreck social cohesion and cause a useless waste of human life can wreck a society very, very quickly. But it can also make a very powerful contribution to enabling everyone to make their unique contribution to society and to make that society a happier place. And I think from the little I've learned about Cleveland and this area, it seems that religious people do relate well to one another. And you might say, we cannot run the world, we cannot change the world, but we can start by working in the place where we are and make it a better place by religious people understanding each other and working together. Okay, thank you.
Recently, I believe it was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I think also the Pope, I'm not sure if he's the most person who broke down the church. They issued statements separately
Yeah.
to the Islamic countries like Saudi Arabia,
Yeah,
and I think Iran may have been in there, maybe two others,
Yeah.
urging them to allow Christians practice openly and freely
Sure.
the religion. Of course, we have heard stories about the attacks on Christian churches.
Yeah,
and all that. If you were advising these individuals, or if you were trying to maybe bridge that gap with the Islamic countries, what would your approach be?
Well, I don't remember the exact wording or the details of that, but I think it has to be done as people from outside. The advice that you give, as has happened about Egypt, we cannot just say, now you ought to do this or that. We have to, as it were, give advice that people are likely to listen to. I think it's a very difficult situation for the Archbishop or for the Pope or any church group trying to give advice like that. But what I meant when I said that religion in the UK is weak, not because the present Archbishop of Canterbury is not doing his best to promote it, or anything like that, or any of the other archbishops. But basically, I think it's because with the state church, the state is just accepted in England. But it does not mean that most members of Parliament and so on feel any need to support religion. It's a strange thing. We have and we haven't. I mean, some people even say we'd be much better without a state church, because then we'd know that religion had its own voice. But what I'm saying is this, that there isn't any easy solution to relating religion and politics. But my view is that they have been kept apart far too much in the UK I'm talking about. That is, at times when people should have spoken out in public, the church could be strong. It wasn't. And I think what religious authorities will sometimes say, but we went to the House of Lords or behind backs and we spoke to such and such a person and we did make our point. But it never appeared in public and they didn't win the point. Now, I'm not on for that nice, decent, religious person who sits back and says, our government must know best. Those of us who've lived through the last 30, 40, 50 years know that very often our governments are struggling just as much as we are. And they need not just extremists to tell them what to do, but they need every normal, hard-working, clear-thinking citizen to give their opinion. And we won't agree on these things. But I think, what I think you're saying is what I would say is that where possible, we must support politically as well as religiously those who need us. And that the situation in Egypt was very tragic recently. And I think that there is a place for Christian leaders rather than political leaders to say these things, because They have a right if these people are related to their communion or their church. Yes?
I know in America we have separation of church and state, but you said that the RE schools that are taking place and doing well from what you said in England, but is that helping not only increase the numbers of people that are religious or the understanding between them? Would you suggest that being done in the United States?
What I mentioned about Geneva is not the same. It is a limited form of RE to ensure religious literacy. That is, that I can well understand the separation of church and state. But I understand there have been some experiments here and there, and that states do differ in the United States. And that maybe the churches ought to look carefully at any successes or benefits that have come from these new experiments over the last 20, 30 years that have been made. My view is, in the UK, you cannot really say that the education that people get about religion in school makes more Christians or whatever. That, I think, is impossible to say. What we do know is that if it is not there, then all kinds of stereotypes, all kinds of horror stories. For instance, that the Muslims in Bradford slaughtered their own animals because they didn't have initially a proper slaughterhouse of their own, as it were. And they put all the entrails down the public drains and blocked all the drains in Bradford. That was a story that many people in Bradford believed. And all the stories that have been told about Jewish people down the centuries, they've drink the blood of children, and all kinds of nonsense stories. And yet, in the popular history, these things often go unchallenged. And people who want to antagonize society repeat them without question. Now, what I think has happened is that the UK is a much more peaceful and tolerant place because young people at school are learning about the other's faith, and they're also learning about the other people. My daughter's children live in London, in Brixton, right in the centre, a very multicultural area, and they've chosen to live there. And their young people, 5 and 9, they don't even find it strange. They think it's strange to come to Wales, where I live, and there's no black people. So it's what you're used to. But I think that some people say, if it doesn't make people Christian, why have religious education? It is to make them religiously literate, and that will help to prevent hatred and intolerance in the normal society. Yes?
I want to thank you tonight for a very passionate appeal for inclusiveness and against prejudice. So you don't have to answer this question because I have a feeling that my question is because on last week's lecture,
Okay, yeah, sure.
But I had the sense from what you said tonight that at least in part you were basing your appeal upon the arguments of Paul in his letters. If that's the case, could you just briefly, for my benefit, state again what that connection was and how it undergirds your argument?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah. The connection was with identity in Paul. That Paul stated that Jewish people who followed Christ should retain their own identity as Jews, and that Gentiles likewise should retain their identity. And so in that sense, and then I argued from that if that identity is retained, then that Jewish calling of those who are in Christ is regarded as God's calling, and the Gentile calling similar. And that if that is so, then there is no need for people to change the calling in which God called them. Now, if we apply that to Christianity as a whole, there is no need for Christianity to change the calling which they received as initially in Judaism. So in that sense, that calling is still the same. We are not called out of Judaism, not called out of the synagogue. Some people think ecclesia, the church or assembly, means out of the synagogue. That is a biased and nonsense interpretation. It means that we are called where God first called us. And my interpretation is that that means we have to be embedded in our Jewish foundations. And then to apply it to the modern period, identity becomes much more varied, much more confused. And I am not entirely happy that many of the theories are not just based on individuals. Society is what gives to young people their identity. And if we want to be really involved in our society, then we must make it a place where young people will find the right identity for them. And if it is not a place where they find their identity, then they cause trouble for all of us and for themselves, and many young people meet disaster because the society did not provide them with a proper understanding for life. Jesus said, "A sheep without a shepherd." And I think that there's many young people in the world today caught between cultural conflicts, and they don't know where to go, and there's no one to guide them. And I think that in that sense, we ought to try to give all the young people in our society a proper self-understanding, whether they're religious or not.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Good
Can I just ask you, in your interpretation of Paul,
Yep.
would you hold that those who are called as Jews
Yep.
and those who are called as Gentiles both had a responsibility to accept the new revelation of Christ? Or would you hold it as two separate tracks, like Christ for the Gentiles and Jews?
No, that's not my view, though it's very similar to mine. But that's one in which I'm frequently placed. But what I say is that the coming of Christ made a difference even for people who were Jewish. Now, that doesn't mean to say they stopped being Jewish. But there was a debate then as to whether or not this is a new revelation of God. And so in a sense, they had that challenge as to see what to do with it and so on. But it's much more complicated than that. But my position is this, that there is no way in which Paul would allow people to, or would force people to give up their Jewish identity. Okay. Yep.
Are you saying like simply teach children?
Sorry, I can't hear very well.
Are you saying simply to teach children about various religions, or kind of to like impose your own religion on them so that they have a starting point? Like what you're saying religious education? So are you religiously educating on your own personal views?
No.
Plus others?
No, what I said was that in university or in school, you do not teach yourself. Some of us do when we're short of notes and so on, but we're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to teach the most modern, up-to-date research in our area and teach it in a proper way to our students. Now, in the school system in the UK, students must not only have a degree, but they have to have a proper authorized teaching certificate. And it's usually in one subject or another, or maybe two subjects. So therefore, to teach religious education, you need a degree in religious studies. But what we changed was that this does not have to be in Christian theology. It can be in religious studies, or Muslim studies as well. So what I mean by do not teach yourself is that you teach what is generally accepted as the best educational and intellectual understanding of these faiths. So it's what the understanding of the faith that would be acceptable in a university or anywhere else, a properly intellectual organization. And so therefore, if you wanted to if you were, say you're got some very odd understanding of life, and you want to get into school to teach that to children, there's no way that you could do that for very long, because that is not, you are there. I mean, any teacher, for instance, if you're representing another view in Christian theology or another group of people, a good lecturer's task is to give a balanced and fair judgment about the views that other people have. We're not in this business of scoring points over each other as when we're on TV. So in school, therefore, you as a teacher, whatever the subject, religion or otherwise, you will try to give a proper, balanced view of what is normally believed to be the case about this people's faith. Now, it's not that simple. There have been cases where, in the teaching of history, places in the West Indies, for instance, whose version of history do you teach? The English view, UK view, or the local view? And when you're talking about the history of the Second World War, from where do you teach? There is a German perspective. Many normal, decent people in Germany suffered as much as we did. And so it's not simple, because we have, what I think I'm saying, what you're aware of, is that there isn't just an objective amount of knowledge. There is a subjective input from the teacher. And that means that I choose the things that are interesting to me. And I teach about identity maybe when somebody else would teach about liberation theology. It comes through the person. But it must be judged by those in charge in society that this person's views are such and his education is such that he or she will be able to teach young children without misleading them. I think what we have said to our students, if they know you're a Christian, if they know you're a Muslim, it's much better to say so. And then people will know where you're coming from. And young people will accept that. But they will not accept it if you stand at the edge and say, well, here's one view and here's another. I think it comes through the person, but the person must be properly trained and educated. My daughter works in a small university in Birmingham where she's in charge of the postgraduate certificate in education. And she has exactly that job, to make sure that the people who go into those schools are people who will be balanced and moderate and take good care of the children that they're teaching. It is possible. It isn't the solution to every religious problem. If parents do not teach their children, and if churches and mosques and so on do not do their work, then this religious education will not be enough. It is a good help, it is a great thing, but by itself, it would not be enough. Yep.
Putting it another way, are you saying that in England you teach the facts of a religion and not its interpretation?
Yes, in one sense you're right, but you cannot. There is no such a thing as bare facts. I mean, this is the problem I mentioned with history. History, I think our analogy was, if you are looking at the world, you're looking at it from some particular point. You can't look at all the world at once, and you can't stand at all the world. You've got to look at it from where you are. And what I mean by that is, that means there will be some interpretation of history, and there will be some interpretation of religious texts. But what you're guided by there is what the scholars and teachers who are expert in that area, including the experts in their own faith, you would go by what they say, not by what you thought yourself. So in other words, you'd be guided by those who are in the faith, who are experts, as well as those who are experts in education generally.
Would you be basically, as I understand it, you're calling for at least a course in what we used to call comparative religion, where you
Yes. I don't like comparative religions, and because it has to me, it has the echo of comparing one and seeing which one is best. I know that's what's meant. But when I came first as head of a department to West Hill College at Selly Oak Colleges in Birmingham, I had a course just like that, and it was called comparative religion. And we changed it. It was the three religions were Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. And we changed it to the destiny of man in three religions. Now, it was the same thing. but it wasn't. It didn't have the comparative element. But you're right. I think that what people need is a proper education about what our neighbour believes, and so that we understand them, and also that we know when nonsense is spoken about them, and slander is deliberately portrayed. Then I think that what I tried to bring over is that in times of crisis, and we had it with Tony Blair and the crisis of Afghanistan and so on, Iraq, and in this time, people were very emotional. You could have a fight with someone on the doorstep at a moment's notice because they were being asked to make huge decisions and they didn't know how and when to make them. And also, one person was saying, this is right, the other is lies, and so on. Now, there's emotions going around really strong. And this is the same in the situation in Ireland at the time of the great crisis and the troubles and so on. Emotions were high. And so you've got to put together not just ideas, but the fact that the emotions. So sometimes we used to have a saying in Ireland when a man spoke nonsense, they said it's not just him speaking, it's Guinness speaking. So the Irish like their Guinness, which I don't. But so it was, or Johnny Walker was the other. It's Johnny Walker speaking. And now, by that, what they meant was that this is not the real person, but the person under the influence. Now, human beings under the influence of great emotion take sides very differently from what they do when there is no crisis around and it's not so emotional. So what happens is that when a crisis comes, people divide. And that's when you need people to stand up and be counted. And I think it's very, very difficult, because if you know that this is not true about Jews, not true about Muslims, then you have to stand up and say it. Ever so often in social settings, people get carried away very quickly. And it's not long before you get a joke about Irish people or Jews or whatever. And I used to sort of say, well, it's just fun and we all know each other. It is not. The sociologists say the greatest assumption of all is as we all know. And rather than saying what it is, they say as we all know. And that covers a multitude of sins. Now, the young person that I mentioned, he intuitively picked up what people were saying without saying it. Now, that's the great art in the modern society. Post-black and white confrontations, post-multicultural confrontations in the UK. You say what you mean by not saying it. And that double talk is the most dangerous, because that allows the prejudice to flourish underneath the surface. And people say, it's not there. We never said the word. Of course they didn't. They know better. They could be sued for it. Okay. Yep.
I think religious education in our public schools in the United States would be a unifying force for our country.
I just don't know enough. I think it could be.
Well, has it proven to be in England, in the UK?
The trouble is, we don't know what it would have been like without it. And it's too big an experiment to leave it open. A part of the problem is, how do you get authorized and properly educated people that everybody approves? You see, some of the stronger voiced Christian groups say, we don't trust you to teach our children. We will do it ourselves. So in a sense, there is lack of trust within Christianity. And it's easier almost in a more multicultural society, because then you've got very many diverse groups. But I think the United States is so varied already. But it may be, what I think I was hoping to suggest is that maybe there are more experiments where there are Christian universities, where there are Christian institutions which can vary their projects so that they really help the minorities of society to find their way and to make a contribution. I think you can talk about choice, but until you have power and money, you have no choice. So what we're saying is that those institutions that are here and that are able could make a change. But again, it's a very difficult topic, and I wouldn't like to pronounce on. I think also, as you see, one of the problems about innovation is you don't know until it happens how well it works and so on. It has worked well in England, and I think will continue to do so. But there is much opposition from atheists and agnostics. Many people say, we know our way of life, we're quite clear about what we need, we don't need religion to help us. And England in particular is a very individualistic country. And so what is felt is that individual people privately, and because there's no such a thing as society, Mrs. Thatcher told us, so therefore they will make up their minds privately in their closets, and we don't need to interfere with their religion. Now that is a very strong view, and it's not simple. I think America is better. At least religion is still a public issue, and it's still something that everybody has a view about. So I think in that sense it is better. But there are many, many dedicated teachers who are not terribly religious themselves, but they are dedicated to teaching religious education. See, that's where the confusion comes. People say, I must be a convinced Christian in order to teach religious education. You do not need to be. You need to be a convinced enthusiast for teaching religious education, just as the same in art. To be a Christian does not necessarily make you a good art teacher, and it does not necessarily make you a good RE teacher as well, though it should do. And many of my students were just such that.